Hello, we're back. So we are still covering the law in relation to teaching and learning. This is the second part for the first week. So if you've watched the previous video, we were talking about the First Amendment to the Constitution and freedom of speech. And we will actually be picking up there again in this video. So not only will we be looking at the freedom of speech for the First Amendment, but for some instances, we'll also be talking about the right to peaceably assemble. So here's a question for you. Are student protests covered by freedom of speech? What do you think? Well, if you said depends, it does depend. It depends a lot on the situation. So here's an example of a protest that took place during COVID, so rather recently, of football players saying that they believe they should be able to play. Usually protests like this that take place on the student's own time, because as we know, schools aren't necessarily in attendance face-to-face during this time period, this was probably acceptable. Students do have free speech. There's a very famous quote by the Supreme Court saying, once you enter the doors of your school, you don't lose your freedom of speech. But there are some guidelines. There are some limits. That speech cannot be disruptive to the school, to the students, to the mission, and it also can't go against the school's rules. Here's a rather famous case that took place in one of our sister states, West Virginia. So there was a student who refused to salute the flag during one of the traditional ceremonies. It went all the way to the court, and it was decided that the student did have the right to refuse to salute the flag, that was part of their First Amendment freedom of speech and religion. Here's another little synopsis of that case, and it talked about how the lower courts did support the students' silent protest or expressed dissent during the recitation of the pledge. So when it comes to student political free speech, refusal to salute the flag or refusal to stand for the pledge is protected as non-disruptive political speech. And again, that is as long as it is not disruptive. Well, protests can also take the form of walkouts. Student walkouts started to become somewhat popular, shall we say, a couple of years ago. When it comes to the First Amendment and walkouts, it's a little bit different because a walkout occurs during the school day. So as soon as that student walks out of the classroom and walks out of the school, they now become truant. It is now an unexcused absence. So because of that, and because they are doing it during school time, it's not necessarily protected, and you can be punished for it. So the First Amendment does not really consider a walkout to be protected speech because it's during the school day, and because, again, it interferes with truancy laws. So student walkouts not typically covered. And where it says that they might also be disciplined, it's interesting to point out that although they can be disciplined, they can't be disciplined more harshly than other students would based upon their message. So if the principal really doesn't like what your political stance is, he can't punish you any more harshly than he would for anyone else. Here's a video to talk a little bit about these previous two topics.
If you're a public school student, you don't lose your right to free speech when you walk into school. Here's the knowledge you want to carry with you. Know your history. Students like you have been speaking out for decades and making history as a result, including in the Supreme Court. In 1965, Mary Beth Tinker, her brother, and another classmate all decided to wear armbands to protest the Vietnam War. The school suspended them and didn't allow them to come back until they agreed not to wear their armbands. The students filed a First Amendment lawsuit, and in 1969, the Supreme Court ruled that you do not shed your constitutional rights to freedom of speech or expression at the schoolhouse gate. This means that schools can't censor student speech or expression unless it disrupts the functioning of the school. You have the right to speak out at school. You can hand out leaflets and petitions, and make political statements, as long as you don't disrupt the functioning of the school. What counts as disruptive will vary by context, but a school disagreeing with you or thinking that you're speaking in bad taste is not enough. Schools can discipline your actions, but they can't discipline your ideas. If you want to walk out in protest, your school may be able to punish you for skipping class or walking out, but it can't punish you more harshly because of the idea that you're trying to express.
So I think that was very well said. That was a video put together by the ACLU. So here's another question for you. What about student dress? Is student dress part of free speech? Should students be able to wear whatever they want, dress however they want? Piercings and hair color and tattoos, because again, it's freedom of expression. Let's take a look at that. When it comes to student dress, clothing that is considered disruptive to learning or vulgar or related to drugs or alcohol is not protected under freedom of speech during school time. So there are limits. Now, there have been some questions about what does it mean for clothing to be disruptive. There are many school dress code regulations regarding female clothing, about how revealing it can be or how tight it can be, and that perhaps that might be disruptive in the learning situation. So this is kind of a sticky issue, and it's one that I think all schools struggle with. So when it comes to clothing, public schools do need to respect your constitutional right of freedom of expression when it comes to messages or political statements, ideas written on your accessories or on your shirts, as long as it's not vulgar, lewd, disrupting the school, promoting illegal activity. So clothing that makes a political statement that is non-disruptive is typically protected. Here's an example though, because, not all schools handle things in the exact same way. So here's a student who was suspended for wearing a Trump t-shirt. Now you can see by the t-shirt, it's not offensive necessarily. You might disagree with the message or disagree with the politics, but I don't see how that particular shirt could be disruptive. So he was suspended. But because, as we just saw, that should be covered under freedom of speech as a non-disruptive political statement, he took it to court and he won. And he got not only an apology from the school, but was financially compensated. And this was in Oregon, by the way. So he was ordered to either go home or cover up, and he took that to the courts. Students can display opinions on their t-shirts that other people may not like and that might make some people angry, but this is not enough to meet that Tinker standard. So for instance, courts have found that schools cannot bar a student from wearing, for instance, something like a black armband. That was from the Tinker case that we saw earlier from the Vietnam War. Buttons that might promote the use of scabs or even promote teachers who are on strike, political t-shirts, or even political organizations such as the NRA. Here's a short video talking a little bit about the idea of disruptive speech and dress.
2. Schools can punish speech that materially disrupts schoolwork, for instance, because it prompts fights. That's why lower courts have let schools ban clothing that displays Confederate flags, and in one case, even clothing that displays an American flag on Cinco de Mayo when that display led to violence. That's a kind of heckler's veto, where threats against the speaker are used by the government to justify restricting the speaker rather than the threateners. Usually the government can't impose such a heckler's veto, but the rule in schools seems to be different. That may not seem right to you, but I don't make the law, I just make videos about it. Schools can also punish students for using vulgarities or sexual innuendos, so if you do criticize that teacher over lunch, be, polite about it. 4. Schools can punish speech that seems to praise drug use, and probably also alcohol use and other crimes, at least when that speech doesn't seem political. That's from Morse v. Frederick, where the Supreme Court said a school could suspend a student for holding up a banner that read, "Bong hits for Jesus." Yes, this is a real case. In fact, you can actually find audio of Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer saying,
"Bong hits for Jesus,"
which is completely surreal. So, legalized marijuana is probably okay, but marijuana is awesome? Probably.
Probably not, is what he was about to say. Okay, here's another question. Are there limits on what you can do online? What you can say online, what you can post online from your home? So if you're at home and you're posting things on social media, can you get in trouble at your school? This is another one of those where it's kind of like, well, it depends. Yes and no. So in terms of online activity for students, and we will be looking at teachers as well. So for students first, if their off-campus behavior is considered to be disruptive to what's happening in the school and connected to the school, it is no longer protected under that First Amendment. So you can't go home and completely trash your teacher online or bash another student and then go back to school and assume that that's okay. Because if that is considered disruptive or bullying, it is no longer protected. If your post has some sort of connection to the school or the staff or the students, the school can punish you for it, even though it's a post that you made at home. So here's an example. So this is West Virginia, and I try to find cases that are close to home whenever I can. So this was a senior who she invited a lot of classmates to view her MySpace profile, and she used that opportunity to seriously make fun of another girl in the classroom. So school officials called it a hate website and suspended her and said this was harassment and bullying. She said, free speech. I can say what I want. I'm at home. It's my own, MySpace site, freedom of speech. The appeals court threw it out. The appeals court said, no, it's not freedom of speech. It's disruptive. It's connected to the school. It's potentially hate speech or bullying. Here's a video looking at online activity.
When something's posted on social media and it's being talked about on campus and it disrupts learning, that's when we have to step in and decide if there's something that we need to react to.
Nationwide, a growing number of districts are watching what's posted online for anything that might impact their schools. Principal Amy Hartgen says the number one concern is safety.
What's okay, we have got to get involved here. Bullying, would that
Absolutely.
be a red line?
Mm-hmm. Threats, intimidation.
What if someone posts something that's offensive language, racist,
Absolutely.
sexist?
Mm-hmm.
Really? Yes. And why would that be a red line?
Because that is just, it's against the campus culture.
Students threatening to harm others or themselves sometimes telegraph that on social media, and districts have been sued for not paying attention to online posts. Students have been disciplined for liking other posts, for private online chats that others made public, for forwarding racist posts even in order to denounce them.
Schools need to think about how do we take on these issues in an appropriate way that doesn't have kind of the collateral damage effect of destroying students' privacy and free speech rights.
Superintendent Gail Pletnick insists the district is careful not to violate free speech or privacy rights.
We're not crossing that line. We're not monitoring people 24/7. We're not the social media police, but we are concerned about anything that we feel will be harmful to our students.
Pletnick says technology changes so quickly that schools can find themselves operating in a gray area.
Those laws, those rules, those guidelines that we're going to have to use are being developed. So we're really not only flying this plane while we build it, while it's being designed.
It can be a rough ride. So Dysart and other districts are increasingly starting to teach digital citizenship, the responsible use of technology, to impress upon students to think before they click.
And I think that's some really good advice. I think it's something that, as she said in the video, schools, principals, teachers are really trying to figure out, because it seems like there's constantly new situations coming up. I can speak to this personally. So my husband is a principal at a high school. He has spent the last entire week, this week, investigating online posts, sharing of a meme that was made about another student that was meant to be hurtful, and trying to track down who created the meme, who shared the meme, trying to see whether or not it fit the guidelines for bullying and what the repercussions might be. So it is something that is challenging, but very important and very relevant to what's happening. So as we continue, what about teachers? Teachers go home, they post things online. Do they need to also be careful about what they say? The answer to that one is very much yes, they need to be careful about what they say, because free speech that's fairly limited for educators. We're put in a pretty tough situation, so our speech is only protected if we are speaking out as a citizen on matters of public concern. We cannot say anything that disrupts the school, that is about the school, that is about the students, without potentially having repercussions. So matters of personal concern. If I get online and gripe about my students or gripe about the parents or say anything bad about my school or my principal, I could get in trouble. I could get investigated. I could get suspended. Also, if I show any photographs or talk about any sort of immoral behavior, whether it be drinking or partying or drug use or whatever it might be. Here are some examples, and believe me, there are lots of them you can find online. So here's a teacher from Georgia. She was discussing her point of view that all lives matter, but she was also talking about the individuals who were protesting for Black Lives Matters and describing them as thugs. So what happened as a result of that? She got suspended without pay. She was forced to go under diversity training, and she contended to that and said that there was a hostile work environment and that forced her out. She filed a lawsuit saying that when she was talking about all lives matter, that she was doing so as a public citizen, not as part of her classroom, but the court dismissed it and upheld her being dismissed. Here's another example. Here's a teacher in Florida who made a post on Facebook that was anti-gay. It was about gay marriage. So it's not about anyone specifically at the school or connected to the school, but it was a political statement that would be considered disruptive to the school, and he was suspended for that. Here's a teacher who made a racist comment about First Lady Michelle Obama online, and she got fired for it. So you can see how you can make some sort of a statement out there online and think you're saying it as a private citizen, but if it is deemed as disruptive, hateful, racist, sexist, homophobic, it's something that you can have repercussions. Here's another teacher. So what happened with this teacher was she was actually writing a blog, and in her blog she talked negatively about her students and called them things like frightfully dim and utterly loathsome. So it should not be any surprise that she did end up getting fired, and she did end up suing, saying that she had freedom of speech to say whatever she wanted to on her blog. But the courts did not support her and said that the amount of disruption she caused in the school outweighed her freedom of speech. All right, so here's another question for you. Is it legal for students to take and share explicit photos of themselves? Now, you might start off thinking, what does this have to do with being a teacher, and why are we talking about sexting? Well, there have been a number of sexting cases involved in schools where the students say, freedom of speech. I'm allowed to do that if I want to. So what if it is consensual? What if the student is saying, yes, I took that picture and yes, I sent it, so can I still get in trouble? This one, the answer again is no and maybe. Let's take a look at it. It's something that's a little bit difficult to decipher, but first I do want to point out that sexting is a real issue in the school system and not just in the high schools. So in this particular example I have for you, this was Parma Heights, Ohio, Valley Forge High School. This occurred with a 15-year-old girl. So you might think, okay, 15-year-old girl, high schools, I can see that happening. I spoke with a superintendent once who told me that his number one problem in the middle schools was sexting, and that he haven't even had to deal with a case of it in the elementary schools. So this is something that could touch you regardless of what grade level you might be teaching. Here's a much larger case from St. Clairsville that involved 47 to 50 different phones that were confiscated and investigated. Typically, students cannot claim freedom of speech as some sort of a defense for having sexually explicit photos of a minor on their phone, of, having possession of those photos. And I think it's important for you to know the laws that are out there in Ohio regarding sexting. If a minor is caught creating, meaning taking pictures of themselves, distributing, sending pictures of themselves, or even just having it on their phone because someone sent it to them. Okay, and this is about sexually explicit photos of a minor. You can be prosecuted under Ohio's child pornography laws, and if you're convicted, you could have to become a registered sex offender for the rest of your life. It is not something that goes away when you're no longer a minor. That for the rest of your life, every job application, everywhere you live, you have to register as a sex offender for sending or having sexually explicit photos of a minor, even if they're your boyfriend or girlfriend. So here's one case that occurred in Ohio. And so what happened here was rather interesting. This was one of the first cases where I saw, and I'm going to get my highlighter out, this word right here, autopornography. So sexually explicit photos that you take of yourself. And this is something that seems to be tripping up the court system right here. But this was one case in Ohio where they denied First Amendment protection, even if you're saying, hey, I took the photo myself, and yes, I sent it along to someone. So here's another case, Ashcroft versus the Free Speech Coalition. This was one where the girl's parents came out and said, hey, yes, my daughter took those photos. She has the freedom of speech to do so and the right to do what she wants with them. And this was one where the court said, well, perhaps we should have constitutional protection for teen sexting, and again, that word autopornography that occurs on the teen's own initiative. So some, and there are a few of them, but some courts and cases might support freedom of speech for individuals, even if they're minors, who willingly take and send explicit photos of their own initiative. But this is something that is not common. There are just a few cases here and there. And I have to say, I feel a lot like Oprah when I read those cases and see this, especially when we're dealing with minors. But that is everything that we're going to be covering when it comes to freedom of speech. And I think hopefully it sheds some light on what freedom of speech is and how sometimes this is a word or a phrase that we use maybe without always knowing exactly what we're talking about. But thank you so much for your attention.